Hello, my name is Jennifer Hamm. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Galesburg District 205, and I'm here today to present to you a PowerPoint presentation that was presented at the Board of Education meeting on Monday night, June 8th, regarding the district's current financial state of affairs, and also talking about some of the concerns that we have for the upcoming FY21 fiscal year. I want to review the presentation outline today. We are going to be dividing this presentation into three different parts. First, we're going to review how is District 205 funded from local, state, and federal sources. We're going to be talking about the financial state of affairs, both past and present for District 205. And then finally, we're going to be talking about the challenges and concerns that we have for the upcoming FY21 fiscal year, which will be our 2020-2021 school year. So to start, we're going to talk about funding sources. So how is Galesburg District 205 funded? We have three different revenue sources that are divided into three revenue buckets. We have local revenues, state revenues, and federal revenues. And this pie chart on this slide here shows that 10% of our revenues come from federal sources, 41% come from state sources, and 49% of our revenues come from local sources. And we're going to be discussing what goes into each one of those source categories. So in local funding, we have three different primary areas where our local funding comes from in terms of revenue. We receive property tax revenues. We receive revenue from 1 cent facility sales tax. We receive revenue from CPPRT, and we have a very small revenue stream that comes from fees and athletic ticket sales. And that comprises 49% of the total revenues for the district. From a state funding perspective, which is 41% of our total revenues, we receive monies from the evidence-based funding model, categorical grants such as transportation, specialty grants, ag education, truancy grants, and then from federal sources, which comprise 10% of our revenues, we receive money from ESSA, which is our Title I, Title II, and Title IV programs, our rural and low-income student grants, and one-time federal response grants like the CARES grants. And we're going to be talking about each one of these revenue streams in more depth in coming slides. So looking at local sources, we're first going to start to talk about the property tax cycle, because this is probably one of the more confusing aspects of school funding and how districts receive their revenues. Galesburg District 205, because of the size that we are, is on the accrual method of accounting. And the accrual method of accounting makes things a little bit challenging. It's a little hard for people who don't work with it to understand. But in essence, in terms of revenues, we are operating the majority of our fiscal year with 52% of our local revenues not being received until after that fiscal year ends. So I know that sounds very confusing, but we're going to go through this information, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll understand why this is a challenge, and then why having ample fund balances is so important when you are on the accrual method of accounting like District 205 is. So each December, the Board of Education passes a local property tax levy. The levy is passed in December, and for instance, in December of 2019, that was a request of all the taxes that are to be collected in 2020, but actually for the tax year 2019. So those of you who are homeowners or own property in the district, or who own businesses in the district, you know that your property tax that you pay in 2020 actually is for what your property was valued and the taxes for the year 2019. So it's always a year behind. Because the equalized assessed valuation, which we refer to as the EAV, and that's the value of all properties that are within the school district's boundaries, are not set in December when we actually have to set the levy the district does not know the actual dollars it will receive until the final extension calculations are forwarded to the district in April and May of each year. There is not a set date of when those extension calculations have to come to the district. There are a variety of factors that may delay those at the county clerk's offices, but typically we receive them anywhere from the middle of April to the beginning of May. The challenge for District 205 is the district is on, once again, as I said, the accrual method of accounting. And in terms of property taxes, what this means is that 50%, 52% of the revenues in a budget year are not collected until after the fiscal year is over. So the auditors then do what we call book back the property taxes between June and October. So this is important, once again, because the district must have ample cash reserves in order to make our monthly payroll and pay our bills until those revenues and those tax collections are received after the end of the fiscal year. So for instance, in FY19, our property taxes that we collected were $20.8 million. A little over 10 million of that went to fund, obviously, the FY19 budget, but were not collected until after the FY19 year was over. It's a little confusing, but that is one of the nuances of the accrual method of accounting. This next slide shows how our budget cycle and our property tax cycle really work together and how the money flows throughout the year. So if you look at the September 2020 bubble, this year in September, we will be passing the 2020-2021 budget. So 48% of the local revenues that will go to fund the 2020-2021 budget are going to be from tax collections for tax year 19. So those will be those tax collections that we're receiving beginning in June of this year, and typically we receive all of those payments by October. So in terms of funding this coming year's budget, that's great. We have 48% of all the local money before October to help pay bills and to make payroll for the rest of the year. The challenge comes in, once again, the accrual method of accounting, where 52% of those local revenues won't be collected until tax year 2021 collections begin. And as you know, through your own property tax cycle, those collections, usually your property taxes are due June 1st. And so within 3 weeks, we start to see our first revenues from those sources. But by June 30, our budget year is over. So we are running the majority of the year on just 48% of our local revenues. And then, as I said, once again, the auditors come in once those tax collections occur after the fiscal year ends and book those back to the previous year. So after September of this year, in December, we will pass a levy, and that will be for the 2020 tax year. So as we said, we are building a budget on 52% of revenues that we will not receive until the 2021 tax year. What makes it even more challenging is when we pass this levy in December, we don't know what the EAV, or that equalized assessed valuation, of all the property in the district is. The assessors don't have that information compiled. They wait until the end of the calendar year to do that. And so we've developed a budget on an educated guess with strong assumptions and looking at trends from previous years. And we're passing a levy on those same assumptions, but we really don't know what the value of all of our properties in the district will be when we pass that levy in December of this coming year. So then we wait approximately 4.5, 5 months until we receive our extension tax calculation, and that will come once again sometime in April or May of 2021. And now we're already 3/4 of the way through the budget year and the fiscal year. And that's when we know that other 52% of revenues that we'll start collecting in June of 2021, what we're actually going to be receiving. So this is at the point where we typically look at amending the budget so that we can ensure that we are reflecting the correct revenues for the year, but we still don't get to see any of those dollars, and those dollars don't start flowing to the district until those first tax payments are made in June, and then the county clerks have an opportunity to forward those revenues on to the district. And then at the end of June, June 30th each year, our budget and fiscal year ends. Those first tax payments are coming in to fund the budget and fiscal year that just ended, and 52% of those dollars will be booked back. So you can see why having ample reserves in our operating funds, which are the education fund, operations and maintenance, transportation, and working cash, are so essential, because if we didn't have those reserves, we wouldn't be able to make bill payments and to cover payroll until we have those next year's tax receipts coming into the district. So looking at other local sources, we also have a 1-cent sales tax that many of you, I'm sure, can remember, which was passed about 10 years ago. And the revenue from the 1-cent sales tax is very specific. It can only be applied to bond payments for capital projects, or it can also have revenues placed in Fund 60, which is for capital improvements to buildings. So that can't go to buy supplies, it can't go to make payroll or to make normal bills. It can only go towards capital improvements. In 2011 and 2014, the district sold alternate revenue bonds and secured those bonds with future revenues of the 1-cent sales tax. So each of those revenue sources that come in each year from the 1-cent sales tax go to pay outstanding bond obligations from 2011 and 2014. In FY19, the district collected $2.9 million from the 1-cent sales tax to pay those 2011 and 2014 bonds. The next source of local revenue is CPPRT, which is Corporate Personal Property Replacement Tax. And Corporate Personal Property Replacement Tax was established in 1979, and it is still used today. The same calculations from 1979 that were established are still used. It is a tax on corporate net income, and it is collected by the Illinois Department of Revenue and distributed to schools. The percentage of distribution is based on corporate property that existed in your community in 1979. And here in just a moment, we're going to talk about why that is so important to Galesburg and so beneficial to Galesburg. So how does this collection and distribution work? All of the net income tax for corporations is collected throughout the state and sent to the Illinois Department of Revenue. Each school district receives a percentage of the total dollars collected from around the state. So we're really benefiting from corporations that exist outside of our area, in the Chicagoland area, in the Metro East area around Chicago, or around St. Louis, really all around the state. It's not just corporate taxes from our community. The percentage was established in 1979 and reflects the net tax your local corporations contributed to that total pot in 1979 when this tax was established. Thankfully for Galesburg, there were a lot of manufacturers, a lot more corporations in the community in 1979. So we have an inflated rate compared to those corporations and companies and businesses that exist today. If the percentages were ever to be recalculated based on what companies and corporations you have in your area at this time, Galesburg would lose a significant amount of revenue based on the number of local businesses we have today versus those that existed in 1979. In FY 2019, CPPRT collections were approximately $1.5 million for the district. Other local sources, and this does not comprise a large percentage of our local revenues, but we do receive revenues from fees and athletic ticket sales. Future revenues in these areas will be very minimal for the district because the Board of Education decided this year that we were no longer going to be charging registration fees to families. Also, we anticipate that all of our schools will become part of the Community Eligibility Program for Food Services, which will provide free breakfast and lunch to all of our students, regardless of income criteria, moving forward in the future. And this will, we expect, reduce our revenues from extra milk sales and a la carte items in the 712 complex. And then we have local revenues from athletic events that will most likely be diminished in the 2020-21 school year because of COVID restrictions and continued safety measures that we will most likely be putting into place. So a summary of our local sources and some of the challenges. Each year we develop a budget without a clear picture of what 49% of the total revenues will be for the coming year. The accrual method of accounting requires that the district have ample reserves to cover payroll and bill payments throughout the year. Because once again, 52% of the local revenues received come from property taxes that arrive after the budget year ends and is booked back by our auditors. And then we have a nice revenue stream from CPPRT that is based on corporate net income from around the state. And this can fluctuate greatly on any given year. And this year we anticipate that it will, because we anticipate that corporate revenues will be down because of the COVID-19 emergency. There have been extra expenses incurred by corporations, and all of that impacts their net income and the taxes that are collected to fund CPPRT. From state revenue sources, on this next slide, you can see that we have a variety of different state revenue sources that make up that 41% of the total revenue that we receive from them. So we receive money from the evidence-based model, transportation, early childhood education, special education, other state grants, a variety of small grants like our STEP grant, truancy grant, state free lunch and breakfast program, driver's education, and career and technical education. This next slide shows our state revenue sources in a pie chart form. Anything that says 0% is just it was below 1% and didn't reflect on the chart. Doesn't mean that we received $0 from that. But you can see that this is just a representation that about 86% of all the money that we receive from the state comes from that evidence-based model, which some of you may remember it was called General State Aid prior to FY18, but that comprises the majority of those revenues. State revenues are heavily dependent upon three things: sales tax receipts, personal income taxes, and corporate taxes. In the second half of FY 2020, which is the year that was from July 1st, 2019 through June 30 of 2020, state revenues are projected to be down a total of $2.7 billion. And unfortunately in FY 21, which will go from July 1st of 2020 through June 30 of 2021, state revenues are projected to be down $4.6 billion, which is approximately 10% of the total state budget. These assumptions are based on the idea that the graduated income tax will pass in November after the election. If the graduated income tax does not pass, potentially these revenues are going to be further impacted, and we're going to see further cuts in the state budget. The next slide shows our federal revenue sources. We have a Title I grant that we receive monies from, National Breakfast and Lunch Program, IDEA, which is our special ed grant, Title II, which is for professional development and recruiting, Medicaid matching funds for special education, Title V, which is our rural and low income students grant, and then Title IV grant. The next slide is once again just a pie chart representation of what percentage each of those grants reflects in the total 10% of federal revenue we receive. And you can see that 37% of our federal funding comes in terms of Title I programs, and then 30% comes from our national breakfast and school lunch programs, and then from a variety of those other sources like IDEA and Title II and Medicaid. Federal sources of revenue are targeted for specific populations in our school community. So, for instance, the IDEA grant funds special education programs and services. Medicaid programs reimbursement also help fund special education. Title II funds professional development and recruiting activities for our teachers and our professional staff. Most federal sources of revenue are flowed through the Illinois State Board of Education and are funded on a reimbursement model. This is significant because the state of Illinois is once again seeing a record backlog in payment of its bills. So how this works is we received last year in fiscal year 19, $2 million in Title I funding. We have to spend the Title I money and then ask for reimbursement from the Illinois State Board of Education to approve. And then once they approve that those were allowable expenditures, then they send that to the comptroller for the comptroller to reimburse the district. With the comptroller having a record backlog of bills, we in essence sit in a queue waiting for our turn to get that check, even though the federal monies have already been sent to the state. So we have to wait our turn, wait our line for that check. And that oftentimes we have found in previous years where the backlog has been significant, can take many, many months for us to get that payment. So having ample cash reserves to float that reimbursement is very essential when having these funds. If we don't expend them, we lose them. So we have to expend the money. It's kind of a catch-22 in order to get that reimbursement back. But we have to, once again, be able to make payroll and pay our bills in the interim. So our next part of the presentation is going to be Galesburg 205's financial trends, both past and present, and how the Great Recession of 2008 impacted the district, and also can give us some insight about potentially what the COVID-19 recession will do in terms of a recovery effort. So on this slide, this is just a visual representation of district revenues in a 10-year trend. You can see that the local sources are reflected in blue, state sources are reflected in purple, and federal sources are reflected in the green. The flow through, we're not going to get into that today. That's kind of complicated. Those are not dollars that the district actually sees. Those are monies that are expended on behalf of the district through a variety of programs that have to be reflected in an audit, but there's really no expenditures or revenues in or out for those flow-through programs. The next slide shows our revenue trends for 2010 through 2019, and there's some important things that we want to point out on this slide. So first of all, the effects of the Great Recession of 2008 really had a delayed impact on all school districts in the state of Illinois due to an influx of federal money that was called ARA, and that was part of the federal response in 2009 and 2010, and those monies were flowed to the district and were supposed to help to replace some of the lost revenue that property taxes and other tax collections may have impacted state budgets. Illinois schools saw a decline in funding related to the Great Recession of 2008, really then from 2011 to 2013. So once those ARA dollars that came from the federal sources kind of propped up the state of Illinois in a variety of ways, and those monies were gone, you saw that the state really had not recovered from the recession, and we see a decline in those revenues from state sources. Galesburg 205 revenues only increased in 2011 and beyond because of the passage of the 1-cent sales tax. So our operating funds continued to suffer, but it kind of gives a false impression here because it looks like our revenues were increasing, but once again, those 1-cent sales tax revenues can only go towards building projects and capital projects to improve the buildings. So those dollars didn't help to make payroll. They didn't help to cover our monthly bills. They simply went into building projects that were occurring in the district. So the passage of the evidence-based model of funding in FY18, along with district budget reductions in 2016 and 17, allowed CUSD 205 to rebuild its depleted reserves and really put the district in a strong financial trajectory again until we had this COVID emergency that really came out of nowhere for everyone this year. The next slide shows our operating fund balance trends. This is also just a good representation of what our beginning balances were beginning in 2010 and then what our ending balances were. You can see starting in 2013 that the light purple line on the left is the beginning fund balance representation for that fiscal year. And then you can see the magenta colored line is less than the light purple, which means that we deficit spent in 2013, in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And it wasn't until 2017, after $3 million in budget reductions over 2 fiscal years and the passage of the evidence-based model, that we were able to reverse that trend. And actually, our beginning balances are on the left, the light purple, and were less than our ending balances. And that's what you want to see every year. You either want those two lines to be even at the very minimum, but you always want to save a little in a rainy day fund for what we're experiencing this year and what we anticipate experiencing in the next few years because of the COVID emergency. So our next slide are operating funds trends from 2010 to 2019, and we're only talking about the education fund, operations and maintenance, transportation, and working cash, because that's where the majority of our payrolls and our bills come out of those funds. So beginning in 2013, the district deficit spent for 4 consecutive years. In fiscal years 2016 and 17, once again, as I mentioned, the district had some very difficult decisions to make, and the Board of Education made $3 million in reductions that were needed to ensure the stability of our operating funds and ensure that we were able to make payroll and pay our bills in the coming years. And without these reductions, coupled with the evidence-based model funding increases, the district would have faced a financial insolvency. But thankfully, because of those measures of the reductions and the increased state funding, we were able to reverse that trend. Since 2017, the district has slowly rebounded, and we've increased our fund balances. And while increasing our fund balances, we've also been able to restore programs. So our teaching and paraprofessional FTEs, which are our full-time equivalencies, have been added. So that means we've been able to add teaching positions and parapro positions. All of our teachers have received an annual increase of 3% since 2014. Wage scales for paraprofessionals, nurses, and secretaries have increased, and wage scales for food service, custodial, maintenance, and transportation staff have also increased. So we've been able to save money while also enhancing programs for our students and also giving our employees a nice wage increase during this time as well. The next slide are our operating fund balances for 2010 through 2019. And you can see that the district revenues are following those same trends in those operating funds that we talked about in previous slides. The final slide on this portion of the presentation is our board policy 4:10. So the board has a fiscal and business management policy that basically dictates how many days of operating cash the district has to have on hand to meet these goals and objectives, and then the revenue to fund balance ratio. So our operating fund goal in terms of cash on hand is 180 days of cash on hand. For the FY19 audit, the district had 210 days of cash on hand, which basically means that if we get into a diminished revenue situation, which we anticipate and we'll talk about in the next section of the presentation, that we have that kind of rainy day fund. We have those reserves that will allow us to be able to ensure that we're paying salaries of teachers and making our monthly bills, and that we're able to continue operations to service students to the highest degree possible, given the potential financial constraints. And then our operating revenue to fund balance is 2-to-1, and we have met that goal in FY19, and we will meet it in FY20 as well. So the final section of this presentation are the challenges and concerns for the upcoming budget and fiscal year, and also what we're looking at in terms of potential challenges for almost the next decade. So what are some of the unknowns that we're dealing with at this point in time? We really don't know what instruction will look like in the coming school year. We don't know if instruction will be in person. We don't know if instruction will occur through e-learning formats, or if there will be some kind of blended learning format where we reduce class sizes and allow some students to be e-learning on certain days and other students to be able to come into the schools. We are waiting for direction from the governor, from the Illinois State Board of Education, Illinois Department of Public Health. In the interim, we are conducting several forums and information seeking groups in the month of June and July to try to get feedback from various stakeholders in the community on what they see as potential resolutions to these unknowns for the coming year. We also don't know how many students or their parents will feel comfortable returning students to in-person learning environments because of health concerns. So although it may be the decision of either our school board or the Illinois State Board of Education or IDPH to come back to school maybe in a blended learning format, we may have families that simply don't feel comfortable participating in that kind of format and may require additional services through e-learning. And then finally, we don't know how our employees are going to feel, if they are going to feel comfortable in returning because of the health concerns, or may have health concerns of their own that will limit their ability to be in the district. Some of the concerns we have from a revenue perspective: local revenues, we anticipate that our property tax collections could be down as much as 30%. The reason that this is a concern is because typically you have a due date for your taxes, and if you do not pay your property tax, either from a residential or commercial perspective, after 120 days, then that property can be placed up for a tax sale. Because of the COVID-19 emergency, there has been legislation that has passed that has basically said that all tax sales will be suspended for a minimum of 1 year or until the COVID-19 emergency resolves itself. So in essence, we may have people in our community, both people that own commercial properties, people that own residential properties, that are unable to pay their taxes. And so really there's no threat to them losing those properties because of this recent legislation. But that could also mean that we see a 30% decline in what we're able to collect at the local level. And if you remember from the beginning part of our presentation, 49% of our revenues come from property taxes and other local sources. And the majority of that, almost 21 million, comes from property taxes. So if we are seeing a 30% reduction in our collection rate, to just do some quick math, we could be looking at a reduction of $3.5 million just in that collection that could be delayed for a year, 2 years, many years in the future to come. We also are anticipating that our CPPRT revenues will decrease by 20%. Once again, if you remember back in that early part of this presentation, CPPRT revenues are based on corporate net income. The corporate net income in the state of Illinois will be down for FY20 because of additional costs for corporations, because of closures, for a variety of different reasons. So when you look at those two pieces of our local revenue puzzle, the potential impact is a decrease of $6.5 million in either delayed or reduced funding just from local sources. From state revenues, the state of Illinois, once again, is projecting a $4.6 billion shortfall, and that is predicated on the passage of the graduated income tax. So if the graduated income tax does not pass, we could see a budget shortfall that exceeds that $4.6 billion. That will result in a couple different things in terms of school funding. So we will most likely see prorated payments for that evidence-based model. We will see prorated or reduced payments altogether of categorical grants. Back in 2013, 2014, we saw categorical grants such as transportation where we received 2 out of 4 of those payments, and those have never been made up. So the district never was able to recuperate those, and wasn't just District 205, it was all districts in the state of Illinois. We could also see prorated payments in the evidence-based model. So we're looking at a potential impact of $6.5 million from state revenues. From a federal revenue standpoint, we are fairly confident that we will receive all of our federal revenues, and we actually have been given an allotment of $1.5 million in CARES Act money, which is part of the COVID-19 federal response. That money was specific to helping schools deal with the e-learning challenges. We are directing our money from the CARES grant to fund purchase of new technology so that if we are in a blended learning environment or in a full e-learning environment next year, that we have the proper equipment and technology for both students and staff to be able to continue that important learning that may have to happen remotely. Some other concerns are concerns about the recovery. So we obviously aren't at the point of where we can fully start talking about recovery. But to just look back at some historical information, the Great Recession of 2008 decreased property values and diminished sales tax revenues for a number of years, resulting in a decline in revenues for schools really from 2009 and 2013 until we started to see that trend reverse. Once again, if you look back at those PowerPoint slides, there was ARA money that came in to help prop up school districts for 2 years. But at the end of the day, we've never fully recovered from that Great Recession and those decreased revenues and values of property in this area. Illinois analysts who work with school districts specifically, and that's PMA and Forecast 5, believe that the earliest a recovery will begin to occur is 2022. So that's a long time to be seeing either flat growth in EAV, diminished tax returns, diminished corporate net income. So we still have quite a bit of time here before, at best case scenario, we can start to see the recovery begin in Illinois. And the Congressional Budget Office recently stated that it believed, from a national standpoint, that a full recovery from COVID-19 could take as long as 9 years. So that's a very, very long time for us to try to make up and recover fully from the diminishment of these revenue sources. So this is once again why the Board of Education is looking at a variety of different measures for the 2020-2021 school year, looking at how we can preserve our fund balances to offset some of the diminished revenues and still provide a quality education for all of our students pre-K through 12th grade. I hope after listening to this presentation, you have a little better understanding of how school finance revenue works, some of the trends of our financial state of affairs in the district since 2010, and then some of the challenges and concerns that we have for not only the upcoming budget and fiscal year, but also for several years to come, not knowing how long we're going to be in this COVID-19 emergency. If you have any questions after listening to this presentation today, feel free to email me at jhamm, and that's JHAMM, at Galesburg District 205. I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Sometimes school finance can be confusing, and I'm happy to sit and talk with anyone who has further questions. Please tune into the monthly board meetings as we discuss these items and concerns. We're currently doing those through Zoom meetings to adhere to social distancing and protect everyone's health and safety. And you can see in coming months how the district is going to be responding to these challenges. Once again, thank you for tuning in and have a safe and happy Friday.